I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
I was checking the germination records for the Odontoglossum hybrids, wondering if I could slip out for a late movie without Wolfe noticing, when the doorbell gave a low, mournful buzz. It was 10:42 p.m., an hour when the only people on the streets are those who have nowhere to go, or those who shouldn't be going anywhere at all. Outside, a thick, greasy fog had rolled in from the Hudson, the kind that turns Manhattan into a series of disconnected islands and makes every street lamp look like a ghost with a hangover. I looked at the monitor. It showed a man standing on the stoop who looked like he had been wrung out and hung to dry in a damp cellar. He was wearing a salt-stained pea coat and clutching a cap in his hands, as if he expected me to fine him for standing there. I pulled the door open, keeping the chain on just in case he had a fog-chilled accomplice behind him. "Yeah?" I asked. "I need to see the Great One," the man rasped. He sounded like he swallowed a handful of river silt. "It's about the cargo on the SS Mariposa. It's not what the manifest says, and men are starting to bleed over it." I took a breath of the night air. It smelled of brine and diesel. "Mr. Wolfe is currently in bed, dreaming of beer and logic. He doesn't see people at this hour unless the building is on fire, and even then, he'd expect a formal invitation from the fire chief. Tell him it's about the blue Mediterranean shipment," the man urged, leaning closer to the gap. His eyes were wide and bloodshot. "Tell him the fog isn't the only thing hiding the docks tonight. My name is Silas Vance." I felt a slight prickle at the name. It was another Vance. ID spent enough time in this house to know that names like that usually carried a heavy weight and a light conscience. I closed the door, went into the office, and used the house phone. I didn't expect him to answer, but Wolfe has a way of knowing when a disruption is significant enough to warrant a grunt. "Yes, Archie." The voice came through the receiver, heavy with sleep and irritation. "Silas Vance is at the door. He's damp, he's nervous, and he mentioned the blue Mediterranean shipment at the Manhattan docks. He says men are bleeding." There was a long silence. I could almost hear Wolfe's brain shifting gears, pushing aside the orchids and the Epicurean delights to make room for a puzzle. "Bring him in," Wolfe rumbled. "Give him a brandy. I shall be down in 10 minutes. And Archie, check the hall for moisture. I will not have my rugs ruined by a man who cannot find an umbrella." I went back to the door and let Silas Vance in. He practically fell into the hallway, leaving a trail of damp footprints on the parquet. I led him into the office and steered him toward the red leather chair. He sat on the edge of it, his eyes darting around the room as if he expected the bookshelves to collapse on him. "You're Goodwin," he said, squinting at me. "I've heard you're the legs. Well, you're going to need them tonight. There's something at Pier 54 that shouldn't be there, and the people who put it there are starting to get twitchy." I didn't answer. I poured him a brandy finger and sat at my desk, opening my notebook. The house was silent, save for the distant, muffled sound of the elevator moving upstairs. The brownstone was no longer a sanctuary. The fog had found a way in, and it brought a cold, salty secret with it. When the elevator door clicked open and Wolfe entered the room, he looked like a displeased emperor in a silk robe. He ignored Silas Vance entirely, crossed to his desk, and sat. He didn't look at the visitor until he had settled his 500 pounds into the chair and taken a deep, centering breath. "Well, Mr. Vance," Wolfe said, his voice a low, dangerous growl, "you have disturbed my rest. You have tracked river water onto my floor. Now, tell me why I should not have Archie toss you back into the mist from which you emerged." Silas Vance didn't flinch. He leaned forward, his hands trembling on his knees. "Because, Mr. Wolfe, by dawn the Mariposa will be empty, and the man who owns the docks will be a murderer. And I think you're the only man in this city who knows why the crates are filled with lead instead of silk." Wolfe's eyes narrowed to thin slits. He didn't look interested, but I saw the way his thumb twitched against the arm of his chair. He was hooked, and I knew my late movie was officially a casualty of the Manhattan docks. The fog didn't stay on the doorstep. It seemed to cling to Silas Vance's clothes, filling the office with a briny, oppressive dampness that made Wolfe's nose wrinkle in rhythmic intervals. Before Silas could expand on his leaden crates, the doorbell rang again, and then again, a sharp contrast to the first visitor's hesitant buzz. This was a frantic staccato demand for entry. I looked at Wolfe, who gave a curt nod of his head, a gesture that for him was practically a violent shove toward the door. I went to the front, checked the glass, and saw a pair of men who looked like they'd just stepped out of a boardroom that had been built on top of a coal barge. One was tall, with the kind of silver hair that suggests a life spent counting other people's money. The other was shorter, thick-necked, and wore a trench coat that had seen better days, and certainly better weather. I opened the door, and they moved in with the practiced ease of people who don't wait for a welcome mat. "I am Julian Vane," the tall one announced, his voice smooth and cold. "And this is my associate, Mr. Vance, not the one you have in there, I assume, but his cousin Gregory. We are here to ensure that Silas doesn't say something he'll regret." I led them into the office. The room was getting crowded, and the atmosphere was turning as thick as the soup Fritz had been simmering since noon. Silas Vance nearly fell out of the red leather chair when he saw the newcomers. Gregory Vance, the thick-necked cousin, didn't sit. He stood by the globe, his eyes fixed on Silas with a look that suggested he was mentally calculating the weight of a body tied to a cinder block. "Mr. Wolfe," Julian Vane began, taking the yellow chair and crossing his legs with a flourish of silk hosiery. "Silas is a man of vivid imagination and very little stamina. He has likely told you some tall tales about the SS Mariposa. I assure you the shipment is perfectly legal, and the bleeding he mentioned is nothing more than a minor industrial accident involving a loose winch." Wolfe leaned back, his eyes moving from the terrified Silas to the polished Julian. "You speak with the confidence of a man who owns the winch, Mr. Vane, or perhaps the man who neglected to oil it. Why come here at midnight to clarify an industrial accident?" "Because the dock workers are on the verge of a strike," Julian replied smoothly, "and the foundation of my shipping empire rests on the timely arrival of that silk. Silas here is a foreman who has recently developed a conscience, a very expensive and very inconvenient one. He thinks he saw something in the crates. He is mistaken. I saw the lead," Silas shouted, his voice cracking. "I saw the crates from the blue Mediterranean line. They were heavier than any silk I've ever hauled in 20 years on the pier, and when I tried to look closer, Gregory's boys pushed me off the gangway. Gregory Vance took a step toward the red chair, but I moved into his line of sight, leaning casually against Wolfe's desk. He stopped, his jaw tightening. Wolfe didn't even look at him. He was staring at the ceiling, his fingers interlaced over his center of gravity. "A shipping mogul, an angry cousin, and a frightened foreman," Wolfe murmured. "And yet, the circle is incomplete. Archie, there is a car idling at the curb. I can hear the exhaust through the window. Go and invite the fourth member of this delegation inside. I dislike having people wait in the wings. It's bad theater." I went to the window, pushed the curtain aside, and saw a sleek black sedan parked at a crooked angle. I headed to the door and walked out into the mist. A woman was standing by the car, her face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat and the swirling fog. She didn't wait for me to speak. She walked toward me, her heels clicking on the damp concrete. "Is Silas still alive?" she asked. Her voice was low, melodic, and held a tremor of genuine fear. "He's in the office, being glared at by his cousin and lied to by a mogul," I said. "You might as well join the party." We're short on chairs but long on tension. She followed me inside. When she entered the office and removed her hat, Julian Vane's composure finally cracked. He stood up, his face turning a sickly shade of grey. "Lydia," he whispered. The silent partner, Wolfe observed, his eyes finally opening to take in the entire group. "The circle is now closed. 4 people, 1 ship, and a cargo that is supposedly silk, but weighs like lead. Please, everyone sit. I find that when the fog is this thick, the truth is often much easier to see." The introduction of Lydia Vane, Julian's estranged wife and a primary shareholder in the Vane-Goddard line, acted like a chemical catalyst in the room. The air didn't just feel damp anymore, it felt combustible. Wolfe sat immovable, his gold-flecked eyes traveling from one face to another with the clinical precision of a jeweler checking for flaws in a diamond. I took my place at my desk, pen poised over my notebook, ready to record the inevitable slips. In this house, we don't need a rubber hose or a bright light to get the truth. We just need 4 people who hate each other and a chair that doesn't let them escape. Let us define the positions. Wolfe rumbled, his voice filling the room. Mr. Silas Vance, you claim the cargo is lead, and that you were assaulted for your curiosity. Mr. Julian Vane, you claim it is silk, and that Silas is a delusional hysteric. Mr. Gregory Vance, you act as the enforcer for your cousin Julian, yet your eyes tell me you have a private agenda that involves more than just family loyalty. And Mrs. Vane, you arrive in the mist, trembling for the safety of a foreman. It is a fascinating tableau of maritime discord. It's more than discord, Mr. Wolfe, Lydia Vane said, her voice regaining its strength. She sat in the small chair I had brought in, ignoring the venomous glare Julian was sending her way. The SS Mariposa is carrying the last of the Goddard family's liquid Assitz-raw silk destined for the European looms. If that cargo is tampered with, or if the shipment is delayed by a strike, the company defaults on its loans. Julian has been gambling on the futures market, and he needs the Goddard assets to cover his margins. Lydia, you are talking out of school, Julian snapped, his face reddening. My investments are my own business, co is silk. The manifests are signed, sealed, and delivered by the Port Authority. Signed by men you've bought with scotch and cigars, Silas interjected, emboldened by Lydia's presence. I saw the crates, Julian. Silk doesn't make a forklift groan like that, and it doesn't leave grey streaks on the wooden slats when it scrapes. That was the lead. Heavy, industrial lead. Wolfe shifted his weight, and the springs of his chair groaned in sympathy. Lead is a peculiar choice for a shipping magnate, Mr. Vane. It is inexpensive to buy, but expensive to move, unless one is using it as ballastar as a substitute for something far more valuable that has already been diverted. Is that the play? Has the silk already left the pier, leaving only a heavy, dull echo in the hold of the Mariposa? Gregory Vance took a step forward, his thick hands balled into fists. You're talking about smuggling and fraud, Wolfe. Those are heavy words to throw around in a room full of witnesses. Maybe Silas didn't see the lead. Maybe he just saw shadows in the fog and decided to make trouble for a family that's fed him for 20 years. Gregory, sit down, Wolfe commanded. It wasn't a shout, but the sheer volume of his authority made the man freeze. You are not on a pier now. You are in my office. In this room, the only thing that carries weight is the truth. Archie, what do we know of the Blue Mediterranean Line's reputation? They are known for two things, I said, checking my mental files. Fast ships and flexible paperwork. They've been under investigation twice for tariff evasion, but nothing ever stuck because the witnesses usually ended up taking long-term vacations in South America. Exactly, Wolfe murmured. A company that specializes in the invisible. Now consider the motives. Julian needs the assets. Lydia wants to protect her inheritance. Silas wants to stay alive. And Gregory wants whatever Julian promised him in exchange for his silence and his muscle. But there is a missing variable. Silas, you mentioned men were bleeding. Who specifically? 2 night watchmen, Silas whispered, his face pale. They weren't Gregory's boys. They were outsiders. Men in grey raincoats who didn't talk. I found one of them by the winch, holding his side. He told me to run. He said the blue was coming for everyone tonight. Wolfe's eyes snapped shut, a sure sign that the gears were spinning at maximum velocity. He was no longer interested in the silk or the lead, he was interested in the blue. The office was silent. The only sound was the ticking of the clock and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of 4 people who realized they were no longer in control of the evening. The fog was no longer just outside the window, it was sitting right there on the rug, and Wolfe was the only one who knew how to blow it away. Wolfe dismissed the quartet with a flick of his wrist that suggested they were a collection of particularly uninteresting insects. He told them to return to their respective holes and wait for his summons, a command Julian Vane tried to protest until he saw the look in Wolfe's eyes that usually precedes a verbal flaying. Once the front door clicked shut and the brownstone was ours again, Wolfe sat in silence for a full 3 minutes. He wasn't sleeping, he was calculating the displacement of water and the density of human greed. Archie, he said finally, his eyes opening just a crack. The fog is our ally, provided we are the ones moving through it. I want you at Pier 54. I do not want you to board the Mariposa. That would be a crude and likely fatal mistake. I want you to observe the perimeter. Specifically, look for the men in grey Silas mentioned. If they are not Julian's employees and they are not Port Authority, they represent a third party whose interests are not maritime, but predatory. I didn't argue. I grabbed my trench coat and a flashlight that could cut through a London pea souper. I also checked my shoulder holster. Docks are not places for polite conversation after midnight, especially when the air smells like wet wool and impending violence. I took the sedan, driving slowly through the white wall of the Manhattan streets. By the time I reached the waterfront, the city noise had been replaced by the low, mournful groans of foghorns and the slapping of the Hudson against the pilings. I parked 3 blocks away and moved on foot, sticking to the shadows of the warehouses. Pier 54 was a ghost ship of a dock. The SS Mariposa loomed out of the mist, a massive, dark shape punctuated by a few dim yellow lights on her deck. There was no movement on the gangway, and the cranes stood like frozen prehistoric birds against the grey sky. It looked abandoned, but the hair on my neck told me otherwise. I found a vantage point behind a stack of rusted oil drums and waited. 10 minutes passed. Then the silence was broken by the low thrum of a marine engine. A small tug was approaching from the riverside, its lights doused. It didn't pull up to the pier, it hovered near the stern of the Mariposa. I adjusted my position, crawling closer to the edge of the adjacent pier. 2 figures appeared on the steamer's deck. They weren't wearing the rough canvas of dockworkers. They wore long, grey raincoats that seemed to swallow the light. They were lowering something over the side knot crates of silk, but heavy, canvas-wrapped cylinders. Each one hit the deck of the tug with a dull, metallic thud. Silk doesn't sound like that. Neither does lead. That sound belonged to high-grade steel. Suddenly, a flashlight beam cut through the fog from the direction of the street. It wasn't mine. It swept across the warehouse doors and stopped on a figure leaning against a piling. It was Gregory Vance. He was smoking a cigarette, looking entirely too relaxed for a man whose family was supposedly being ruined. He wasn't watching the tug, he was watching the shore. He was the lookout, but he wasn't looking out for Silas or Julian. He was guarding the transfer. I pulled back, my shoes crunching slightly on the grit of the pier. Gregory's head snapped toward my position. He didn't shout. He just reached into his coat. I didn't wait to see what he was pulling out. I faded back into the mist, moving in a zigzag pattern toward the street. A shot rang out, muffled by the heavy air, the sound flat and harmless sounding until I heard the ping of lead hitting the oil drum I had just vacated. I reached the car and didn't bother with the headlights until I was 2 blocks away. My mind was spinning, steel cylinders, grey-coated ghosts, and Gregory Vance playing double agent on his own pier. It wasn't just a switch of cargo, it was a high-stakes extraction. I needed to get back to 35th Street. Wolfe hates it when I return without the full picture, but I had enough of a sketch to know that the blue Mediterranean wasn't a shipping linet, was a countdown. I pushed the pedal down, the engine's roar the only thing in the silent, dripping night that felt real. Wolfe would be waiting, and for once, I hoped he hadn't already gone up to his plants. I walked back into the office at 1:14 a.m., the smell of the river clinging to my coat like a damp shroud. Wolfe was still in his chair, which was a minor miracle, but he wasn't alone. Fritz was there, looking unusually somber and holding a small silver tray that didn't contain beer. On it sat a single heavy steel bolt and a shredded fragment of blue-dyed silk. Wolfe's expression was a mask of cold, concentrated fury, the kind that usually means someone is about to be dismantled professionally and personally. He didn't ask about my trip to the docks. His eyes were fixed on the items on the tray, as if they were evidence of a cosmic betrayal. The sanctity of this house, Archie, has been treated with the casual disregard one might afford a public park, Wolfe rumbled. His voice was low, vibrating with a resonance that made the glass on my desk hum. While you were out playing tag with Gregory Vance in the mist, someone found it necessary to enter through the basement window. They didn't take the silver. They didn't disturb the orchids. They left this on my desk and took something far more valuable to me. What's missing? I asked, shedding my wet coat and moving to the tray. I picked up the bolt. It was industrial grade, the kind used in heavy maritime winches. The silk fragment was high quality, deeply saturated in a shade of Mediterranean blue that matched the name Silas had mentioned. My ledger of private accounts, Wolfe snapped. the one I keep in the secondary wall safe. It contains not just the financial history of this establishment, but the names of several individuals whose anonymity I have guaranteed. It was a precise, targeted theft. They knew exactly where the safe was located and, apparently, possessed the combination or the skill to bypass it in under 12 minutes. "Fritz?" I turned to the kitchen's master. "I was in the cold room, Archie, checking the aging of the venison," Fritz explained, his voice trembling slightly. "I heard a sound like a heavy weight being dragged, but I assumed it was the house settling in the damp air. When I came up to the office to bring Mr. Wolfe his midnight water, the safe was standing open and that piece of metal was sitting where the ledger should be." I looked out the window. The lock had been bypassed with a professional touch, no broken glass, just a clean manipulation of the latch. They didn't just steal the ledger, Wolfe, they traded for it. This bolt and the silk, Thea a message. Thea telling us that the cargo on the Mariposa and your private business are now linked. It's a ransom note without words. It is an extortionate provocation, Wolfe said, his fingers drumming a rhythmic tattoo on the arms of his chair. Someone believes that by holding my records, they can dictate my movements in the Vane Goddard affair. They wish to ensure my silence regarding what you saw at the pier. And what I saw was a midnight extraction, I told him, pulling up my chair. A tugboat, men in grey coats, and heavy cylinders being offloaded while Gregory Vance played sentry. Silas was right about the weight, but wrong about the lead. Thea moving something that needs steel housing, and Gregory isn't working for Julian, he was guarding the thieves. He even took a shot at me to prove the point. Wolfe leaned back, his eyes closing to thin, dangerous slits. So the silk is a shroud, the lead was a rumour, and the cylinders are the reality. If the Blue Mediterranean is a countdown, as you suggested, then we are no longer dealing with a simple case of maritime fraud. We are dealing with an organised extraction of something the federal government likely doesn't know has left the country. My ledger is being used as a leash to keep me from barking. So what's the move? I asked. Do we call Kramer and tell him the brownstone's been breached? Hell love the irony. No, Wolfe said, the word sharp as a blade. We do not invite the police to witness our humiliation. We handle this internally. The person who entered this house knew the location of that safe. That limits the field to someone who has been a guest here or someone who has studied the blueprints of this house with surgical intent. Gregory was at the docks, and Julian lacked the physical grace for a basement entry. That leaves our silent partner and the frightened foreman. Wolfe opened his eyes and looked at the clock. It is nearly 2 a.m. Archie, call Saul Panzer. I want him at the Blue Mediterranean offices before they open. If they have my ledger, they will attempt to move it to a neutral location. And tell him to be prepared for the men in grey. If they have invaded my home, I shall ensure their next residence is significantly less comfortable. Panzer arrived at the south door at 2:30, looking like a man who had been expecting a call to action and was merely waiting for the signal. He took the news of the burgled safe with his usual stoic composure, though I noticed his eyes sharpen when I showed him the steel bolt. Saul has a memory like a filing cabinet for hardware and faces. He spent 3 minutes turning the bolt in his hand before nodding to himself. He didn't need a map or a lecture. Wolfe gave him his instruction size, sharp and laced with a cold fury that made the air in the office feel brittle. Saul vanished back into the fog, and the brownstone settled into a silence that was less about rest and more about a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. I spent the next few hours at my desk, matching the fragment of blue silk against the Goddard Textile Records ID managed to secure earlier in the month. By 4:00 a.m., the house was a tomb of high-tension thinking. Wolfe hadn't moved from his chair. He was staring at the wall map of the Manhattan waterfront, his lips moving slightly, as if he were reciting a litany of sins. The fog outside had thickened into a white soup, pressing against the windows and isolating us from the rest of the world. It was the perfect environment for a man who does his best work in the theatre of his own mind. The phone rang at 5:12 a.m. I snatched it up before the first ring could finish. It was Saul, and his voice sounded like it was coming through a wall of static. "I am at the Blue Mediterranean offices on West Street, Archie," Saul said, his tone flat and professional. "You were right about the movement. A grey sedan arrived 10 minutes ago. Two men in raincoats came out carrying a heavy leather binder that looks exactly like the one Mr. Wolfe described. They didn't go inside. They met a third man on the sidewalk, Gregory Vance. He took the ledger and headed toward a private garage on 10th Avenue. "Did they see you?" I asked. "Nobody sees me unless I want them to," Saul replied. "But there's more." Gregory didn't stay with the ledger. He handed it to a woman in a black coat who was waiting in the garage. She went to Midtown Tunnel. I am following her now, but the visibility is less than 20 feet. I might lose her if she hits the highway. I relayed the information to Wolfe. He didn't blink. He simply reached for the button to summon Fritz. "Tell Saul to let her go," Wolfe commanded. "I no longer care where the ledger is being taken. I know who has it. You know?" I asked, hanging up the phone. Saul didn't see her face. "He didn't need to," Wolfe snapped. "The woman in the black coat is the only person involved in this sordid affair who possesses the combination of refined taste and desperate necessity. She is the one who left the silk and the bolter signature of her dual heritage. One part Goddard elegance, one part vain industrialism. It was Lydia Vane who entered this house, Archie. She didn't want the ledger for its secrets. She wanted it as a guarantee that I would provide her with a very specific service." "What service?" "Exoneration," Wolfe murmured. "She has realized that her husband's blue Mediterranean extraction is not a simple theft, but an act of high treason. The cylinders you saw contain something the Goddard family has been developing for the Navia, stabilized isotope for deep-sea propulsion. Julian was selling it to a foreign interest to cover his gambling debts. Lydia stole my ledger because she knows I am the only one who can prove she wasn't part of the conspiracy, while simultaneously ensuring the recovery of the cylinders without a public scandal that would destroy her family's name." Logic clicked like a well-oiled lock. Lydia wasn't the villain. She was a desperate woman playing a dangerous game of chess with a man she couldn't afford to lose to. She had invaded the brownstone to force Wolfe's hand, betting that his professional pride would outweigh his anger. "So we're not just looking for a ship anymore," I said. "We're looking for a stabilizing isotope and a way to get your accounts back without getting Lydia arrested for burglary." "We are looking for leverage," Wolfe corrected. "Archie, call Julian Vane. Tell him that if he wishes to see his wife alive and his reputation intact, he will be in that office at 8, and call Silas Vance. Tell him his conscience is about to become very profitable. The fog is beginning to lift, and I find I am quite hungry for a resolution and for breakfast." The morning light was a pale, sickly grey by the time I finished the calls. The fog hadn't fully retreated, it had simply settled lower, hugging the pavement like a cold sweat. Julian Vane had sounded like a man who was already halfway through a nervous breakdown, and Silas had been so eager to find a safe harbour that he nearly tripped over his own words, agreeing to come. Wolfe, meanwhile, had performed his morning ritual with a stubborn adherence to routine that ignored the fact that his private life was currently being held hostage. He had spent his scheduled hours in the plant rooms, and when he finally descended at 11, he was impeccably groomed and smelling faintly of fern and fertilizer. He sat at his desk, and I could tell by the way he adjusted the blotter that he had moved the pieces of the board into their final positions. "Mr. Vane is in the front room, looking like he hasn't slept since the Great Depression," I reported, leaning against the doorframe. "Silas is in the kitchen with Fritz, eating enough eggs to deplete the sicky's supply. And Gregory? Gregory is currently sitting in his car 2 blocks away, thinking he's being subtle. Saul is behind him, and Saul is never subtle to people who know what to look for." "Good," Wolfe said, his voice a low, resonant hum. "Bring Julian in. It is time to apply the heat to the crucible. And Archie, ensure the windows are locked. I do not want any further atmospheric contributions from the Hudson." Julian Vane entered the office with the gait of a man heading toward the gallows. His silver hair was disheveled, and his expensive suit looked like he'd slept in Ita, perhaps just lived in it while his world fell apart. He didn't wait for an invitation to sit. He slumped into the yellow chair and looked at Wolfe with a mixture of hatred and desperation. "Where is she?" Julian demanded, his voice cracking. "You told me on the phone that Lydia was in danger. If Gregory has done something to her, your concern for your wife is a touching, if somewhat belated, development," Wolfe interrupted, his eyes fixed on Julian's shaking hands. "However, Lydia is not in danger from your cousin. She is in danger from you, or rather, from the monumental stupidity of your financial arrangements. You have allowed the blue Mediterranean to become a noose, Mr. Vane. You thought you were selling industrial secrets to cover a margin call. You didn't realize you were handing the keys to a naval propulsion lab to an interest that doesn't use the dollar as currency." Julian's face went from grey to a translucent white. I didn't know it was that. I was told it was a chemical patent, a refined process for synthetic silk. Lies are the comfort of the incompetent, Wolfe snapped. You knew the weight of those cylinders. You knew why the extraction had to happen under the cover of a fog and a fabricated strike. But you weren't the only one watching. Your wife saw the rot, and she took measures to ensure that when the crash came, she wouldn't be buried in the debris. She is currently in possession of my private records, an act of desperation I find difficult to forgive but easy to understand. She knows that if I expose you, I must also protect the Goddard legacy to satisfy my own sense of professional ethics. "I can get the records back," Julian whispered. "I can make Gregory give them to me. Just don't go to the authorities. If the Navy finds out about the isotopes," Im finished. "You are already finished, sir," Wolfe said, leaning forward, his bulk casting a massive shadow across the desk. "The only question remaining is the nature of your exit. You are going to call Gregory. You are going to tell him that the transfer has been compromised and that the cylinders must be returned to the pier immediately. You will tell him that the blue has turned red, and you will do it now while I am still in a mood to allow you a shred of dignity." Wolfe pushed the phone across the desk. It looked like a heavy black weapon in the quiet room. Julian stared at it as if it might explode. Outside, the fog gave one last, ghostly swirl against the glass, and for a moment the office felt like the only solid place left in the world. I moved closer to Julian, my hand resting near my holster, making sure he understood that the time for negotiation had ended and the time for intervention had begun. The bait was cast, and the mountain was waiting for the line to snap. The office had become a pressurized chamber where the air felt too thin to breathe. Julian Vane stared at the telephone for a full minute, his fingers hovering over the dial like they were made of glass. Wolfe waited with the terrifying patience of a landslide. He didn't prompt him, he didn't need to. He simply sat there, a massive, immovable force of nature that had calculated the exact breaking point of the man in the yellow chair. Finally, Julian picked up the receiver and dialed. His voice was a jagged rasp as he delivered the message Wolfe had dictated, telling Gregory that the extraction was a bloodbath and that the cylinders had to be returned to Pier 54 or the blue Mediterranean would be their collective tomb. He hung up and buried his face in his hands, sounding like a man who had just signed his own death warrant. "Archie, go to the front door," Wolfe commanded, his voice returning to its normal, resonant rumble. "Our guests have arrived, and I believe they are tired of standing in the moisture. Bring them all in, every single one of them." I walked down the hall and opened the heavy door. The fog was finally lifting, replaced by a cold, grey drizzle that made the city look like a charcoal drawing. Standing on the stoop was a collection of faces that looked like they belonged in a police lineup rather than a drawing room. Gregory Vance was there, his eyes bloodshot and his trench coat dripping, flanked by two men in grey raincoats who looked like they had been forged in a shipyard and sharpened on a whetstone. Behind them, standing slightly apart, was Lydia Vane. She was wearing a black coat, her face a pale oval of determination, and she was clutching a heavy leather binder to her chest. I ushered them into the office. The room was now so crowded that Saul Panzer had to step out of the shadows and stand by the bookshelves just to make space. Wolfe looked at the group, his eyes traveling over the raincoats, the dripping hats, and finally resting on the ledger in Lydia's arms. "Please be seated," Wolfe said, though there weren't enough chairs to go around. Gregory and the men in grey remained standing, a wall of hostile muscle between the desk and the door. "Mr. Gregory Vance, your arrival is timely. You have brought with you the property of this house, and I assume the news that the blue extraction has been halted." I brought the book. Gregory spat, nodding toward Lydia. "But the cylinders stay where they are until I see the money," Julian promised. "I don't care about propulsion labs or the Navy. I care about $1 million in a Swiss account that hasn't materialized yet. The money does not exist, Gregory, Lydia said, her voice steady as she crossed the room and placed Wolfe's ledger on his desk. She didn't look at her husband. Julian gambled it away months ago. He was using the cylinders to buy his life back from people far more dangerous than you. Is that right, Julian? Gregory turned on his cousin, his hand moving toward his pocket. Enough, Wolfe thundered. He didn't raise his voice often, but when he did, it had the effect of a physical blow. The room went silent. We are not here to witness a family squabble over non-existent funds. We are here to dismantle a conspiracy that has insulted my home and threatened the security of this nation. Gregory, your men in grey are currently being watched by 4 of Saul Panzer's associates from the roof of the adjacent warehouse. If you attempt to use that weapon, you will not leave this room on your feet. Gregory froze. He looked at Saul, who gave him a small, unpleasant smile. He looked back at Wolfe and slowly pulled his hand off his coat. Now, Wolfe said, leaning forward, his eyes locking onto the men in grey. Let us talk about the Blue Mediterranean. It was never a shipping line. It was a code for a specific type of underwater casing used to transport volatile isotopes. You thought you were stealing from a silk merchant. You were actually stealing from the future of maritime defense. But there is a final irony that none of you has grasped. The cylinders you offloaded last night were not the ones you were hired to take. A ripple of confusion went through the room. Silas Vance, who had been hiding in the corner, suddenly spoke. I switched them. When I saw the men in grey by the winch, I moved the crates. I put the silk back in the blue casings and hid the steel cylinders under the coal pile in the boiler room. Wolfe's eyes twinkled with a rare, cold amusement. A conscience is a remarkable thing, Mr. Vance. It has turned a midnight theft into a comedy of errors. The thieves have been holding bolts of silk, while the Navy's secret is currently sitting in a pile of soot. And since I have my ledger back, I find I am no longer in a mood for mercy. The silence that followed Silas' confession was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic dripping of Gregory's wet coat on the parquet floor. Julian Vane looked like he was suffering a stroke. His mouth worked silently, trying to find words that could reconcile his betrayal with the fact that he had been selling high-grade silk to international spies. The men in grey shifted their weight, their faces hardening into masks of professional lethality, but they were pinned by Saul Panzer's steady, unblinking gaze. Wolfe, meanwhile, picked up his leather-bound ledger from the desk, inspected the spine for any new scuffs, and placed it precisely in the center of his blotter. He looked like a man who had just finished a particularly tedious chore and was now ready for the reward. So, Wolfe rumbled, his voice cutting through the tension like a hot wire through wax. The geometry of your failure is complete. Mr. Gregory Vance, you have been guarding a fortune in fabric. Julian, you have attempted to commit treason for a profit that was never there. And you, the gentleman in grey, have compromised your organization for a cargo that could be handled by a seamstress. It is a spectacle of incompetence that would be humorous if it hadn't involved a breach of my basement window. You can't prove any of this, Gregory growled, though his bravado was leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. Silas is a liar and a coward. The cylinders we have are the ones we were told to take. You're bluffing, Wolfe. You're trying to scare us into walking into a trap. I do not bluff, sir, Wolfe snapped, his eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp light. I deduce. Silas Vance did not move those cylinders alone. He used the automated conveyor in the boiler room, a machine whose power consumption spiked at 3:12 this morning. I have already verified the utility logs via telephone. Furthermore, the cylinders you currently hold on that tugboat are sitting 4 inches higher in the water than they should be. Steel-cased isotopes have a specific gravity that silk, however dense, cannot replicate. You are floating on a cargo of lies. Lydia Vane stepped forward, her eyes fixed on Wolfe. And my husband. What happens to him? I brought your records back. I gave you proof of gambling debts. I did what was necessary to protect the Goddard name. You committed a burglary, madam, Wolfe reminded her, his voice devoid of warmth. And while your motives may have been rooted in a desire for preservation, your methods were an affront to this house. However, I am a man of my word. I told you I would provide a resolution that satisfied my sense of ethics. Julian Vane will not be arrested tonight. Instead, he will sign a full confession of his financial irregularities and transfer his entire share of the Goddard holdings to a blind trust managed by the Navy's legal department. He will be ruined, yes, but he will be a free man provided he leaves this country within 48 hours and never returns. And us? One of the men in grey asked, his voice a low, metallic rasp. You, Wolfe said, looking at them with profound distaste, will leave this office and return to your tugboat. You will find Inspector Kramer and a squad of Port Authority officers waiting for you at the pier. You will not be charged with espionage, as the government wishes to avoid the publicity of a stolen isotope. You will, however, be charged with the unlicensed possession of firearms, reckless endangerment, and the attempted murder of Archie Goodwin. It is a messy solution, but a functional one. The room seemed to shrink as the reality of the situation settled. Gregory Vance looked at Julian with a mixture of hatred and pity, realizing that the family empire had turned into a pile of wet coal and blue silk. He turned toward the door, but I didn't move an inch. I stayed right there, my hand resting casually on my holster, making sure they understood that the exit was only available on Wolfe's terms. The fog has lifted, Wolfe observed, glancing toward the window where a sliver of grey morning light was finally breaking through. And with it, the illusions of your grandeur, Archie, called Mr. Kramer. Tell him the blue has been drained. And show these people the door. I find the smell of damp wool and failed ambition is beginning to interfere with my appetite for breakfast. The exodus from the brownstone was a sombre affair, devoid of the theatricality that usually accompanies a police sweep. Inspector Kramer's boys had picked up Gregory, and the men in grey at the curb, and Julian Vane had slunk into the back of a taxi like a man who had finally realized the world didn't owe him a living. Lydia Vane lingered for a moment on the stoop, her silhouette sharp against the clearing Manhattan sky, before she too vanished into the waking city. The house was ours again, and as I closed the heavy front door and slid the bolt home, I felt the familiar, grounding shift from the chaos of the docks to the orchestrated peace of West 35th Street. The fog was gone, leaving the pavement wet and gleaming, and the air in the hallway no longer smelled of salt and desperation. I walked back into the office to find Wolfe exactly where I had left him. He hadn't moved a muscle, but the tension had drained from his face, replaced by that look of supreme, sedentary contentment that usually follows a successful slaughter. Fritz was already there, clearing away the tray with the steel bolt and the blue silk fragment. The ledger was back in its place in the wall safe, its secrets once again shielded by steel and a combination only two men in the world knew. I sat at my desk and let out a long, slow breath, listening to the house settle. Well, I said, stretching my legs. The Navy has their cylinders, Julian has a one-way ticket to obscurity, and the Goddard silk is currently being inventoried by the Port Authority. I'd say it was a fair night's work, even if I did have to play target practice with Gregory in a pea super. Are we going to bill Lydia for the basement window, or is that covered by the professional ethics clause? Wolfe didn't look up from his beer. He was pouring it with a precision that bordered on the religious, watching the foam rise to the exact margin of the glass. The window is a triviality, Archie. A house that cannot withstand a temporary breach is not a fortress but a tent. What matters is that the intrusion was answered with superior logic. Mrs. Vane believed she could coerce me by holding my accounts hostage. She failed to realize that the records of this house are merely reflections of the mind that created them. I do not need a ledger to remember who owes me, or who I owe. She was desperate, I said, and she was right about you. You wouldn't have bothered with a silken lead mystery if she hadn't touched the safe. You're like a hibernating bear. Someone has to poke you with a stick before Yowl go looking for honey. A crude analogy, Wolfe remarked, though he didn't sound particularly offended. He took a long, appreciative sip of his beer and sighed. I do not seek conflict, Archie. I seek the resolution of disorder. The Vane Goddard affair was a tangle of maritime greed and domestic betrayal that offended my sense of proportion. To use a shipping line as a front for the theft of isotopes is not just a crime, it is an aesthetic failure. It lacked subtlety. Unlike Silas moving the crates under a pile of coal, I added, that was plenty subtle. The kid has a future in the business if he ever decides he's tired of hauling rope. Mr. Silas Vance acted out of a primitive but effective sense of self-preservation, Wolfe said, his voice dropping into a reflective rumble. He understood that in a world of predators, the only safety lies in making oneself indispensable to the truth. It is a lesson Julian Vane learned too late. He could sell a secret and keep the profit. He forgot that a secret, once moved, changes its weight. It becomes a burden that eventually crushes the man carrying it. The kitchen buzzer sounded, a discreet, melodic chime that announced breakfast was served. Wolfe stood up, a tectonic shift of yellow silk and determination. He smoothed his waistcoat and looked toward the dining room, where Fritz had undoubtedly prepared something involving kidneys and mushrooms to celebrate the return of the status quo. Ethics, Archie, Wolfe said, pausing at the threshold of the office, are often nothing more than a well-managed appetite. When we are full, we can afford to be virtuous. When we are hungry, we become dangerous. The Vanes were hungry for things they hadn't earned, and they paid the price of their gluttony. And we? I asked, following him into the hall. Are we virtuous or just well-fed? At the moment, Wolfe replied, his eyes twinkling with a sudden, sharp wit, we are about to be both. Provided you don't spend the entire meal talking about the docks. I have had quite enough of the Hudson for one lifetime. Fair enough, I said, opening the dining room door for him. But if a ship full of caviar shows up tonight, don't expect me to answer the bell.